to an overview of the issue, I'm going to break it down into 10 things that you need to know about climate change. And many of you will know of these already, but I think I will emphasise some of them, and some of them may seem a little draconian, but I think you'll find the evidence is building to support the notion that these things are happening. So the first point, I guess, is, as I've said, from the fourth assessment report, is that human-driven climate change is happening. And there are amazing amounts of data now that support these sort of trajectories, and this is the last 1,000 years, showing how unusual the carbon dioxide content of the atmosphere is, as well as the temperatures over the last 100 years, since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. If we then put those in the context of the ice core records, which have been replicated and show a common view, we find that things like CO2 hasn't been above 300 parts per million for at least 420,000 years. If you look at the Apica core, it's 720,000 years. And then if you look at some of the other isotope data, it looks like it may not have been higher than 300 parts per million for 20 million years. Now, at the moment, we're at 380 parts per million and rising at the rate of about 1 to 2 parts per million per year. And we're in very, very unusual territory. And I think coral reefs will demonstrate that aspect. And this is the sort of statement that came out in the fourth assessment report. I think most people have seen this one. It's just basically saying, look, we now know it's humans, it's driving a climate that is now becoming very, very different to where it's been. One of the things about the IPCC report is that it's actually extremely conservative. And if you take this next thing that I want you to know about climate change, and that is that it's probably worse than the IPCC has concluded. If you look at the process of the IPCC, it's a consensus approach. And so if I actually tried to get you all to agree on a particular issue, there'd be some people that'd be quite extreme on either side, some people would be in the middle. But if I got a consensus, I would be narrowing down that range, and by that bringing us away from what might be really good points of view at those extremes. And in fact, Jim Hansen, who has been involved in the debate about climate change right since its obsession in the 80s, has published a paper which I really recommend reading. It's in Environmental Research Letters. And it deals with the reticence that you see within the IPCC process, as well as its consensus building and its conservativeness in relationship to sea level rise. At the moment, if you go to some of the most potent research groups looking at the issue of sea level rise, they'll tell you that it's more than likely that we're seeing the Greenland ice sheet really starting to crumble and destruct, and that sea level rise may be multi-metres over this century. Yet the IPCC has an upper limit of about 0.5 metre. That goes across the entire process. So we have to realise that we're dealing with something that's actually probably a conservative estimate, and it's actually a lot worse than we think. Another point that I'd like to make is that climate change is changing faster than any time over the last 1,000,000 years, and again, probably over a much longer time period than that. Now, you can do this yourself by downloading the Vostok ice core data, and I'm contrasting this. I'm sorry to, I don't come from JCU, but there is an opinion out there, or a line that's taken that, it's all happened before. We've had ice age transitions, and what's so different about a bit of climate change today? And I think we've got to go back. And as I said, to verify this for yourself, download the Vostok ice core data and do this really simplistic analysis. So here's the Vostok ice core data, and this is a pointer. And you can see here the interglacials and the ice age periods. This is CO2 in this case, wobbling around. And then you can see where we are today and where we're headed under the mid-range scenarios. Now take each of those points. Find a better way to do this. And this is, again, I'm not even an ecologist, so I'm not even that simple. You take points along that curve and just look at a 2-point, rate calculation, and then put them into and look at the spread. And what you find is that if you take CO2, the average rate of change per 100 years, 99% of those measurements fall into this range, right? 0.072. Now, if you think that we have gone through 80 parts per million over the last 100, you can see the very big difference between what's been happening and where we're going. And the same with temperature. Very low rates of temperature change. 99% of all these very simplistic rate measurements go in there, and you find that we're way outside that, 0.7 of a degree over the last 100 years, 0.09. Now, if you do that and plot a little diagram here, and this is parts per million CO2 building up in the atmosphere, that's where we were 99% of the time in the past. If you add in the absolute extremes, which are overestimates of that rate anyway, it's probably visible, a very thin slice. Last 100 years, in terms of the relative rate, a B1 scenario, where we top out at about 550 and flatten out, and so on. And you can see with this more aggressive scenario that we're on at the moment, globally, it's even more of a mismatch between what we saw in the past and what we're seeing today. Same with temperature. So you could easily defend the statement that the rate of change is really unparalleled to what we've seen in the past. That period, of course, is over which our species and many other species actually evolved. So we're seeing some very unusual circumstances and so if you look at this and you think about biology trying to keep pace with this, you've only got to think of what happened in the last ice age to think, well, no wonder we're seeing reefs perhaps falling behind. I mean, woolly mammoths certainly fell behind. All right, so I've talked about the issue, and so the last 7 points are going to be on coral reefs. And so the first point is that tropical seas, like the global ocean, are warming very rapidly and they're acidifying. And there's now evidence of all of those things. Janice Lough is going to be talking a little bit about that in the Thursday night tonight session. Now, if you just look at the last 100 years, we've had a 0.7 degree increase in sea temperature, a drop in pH of about 0.1. We've had a bit of sea level rise, and if you calculate carbonate ion concentrations, we've lost about 30 micromoles out of about probably 270 per kilogram water. So these are changes. Now, the first thing that strikes you, of course, is that these are extremely subtle changes. I mean, 0.1 of a pH unit, hardly a degree. Yet, when you look at this ecosystem and you look at all the others like the wet tropics or Amazon and so on, you're already seeing very, very marked changes in those systems. So what about the future? And this is a graph from the IPCC, and it's just indicating that the changes are also not going to be all the same in each place. You get more warming as you get towards the poles. You get less towards the equator. You've got big changes in terms of the condition of the ocean and so on. And, of course, the scenario. These are the socioeconomic scenarios, if you like, about how we build the future. And you can see that this one, which is the mildest one, these ones which are much more aggressive, going for broke. And you can see that there's a big shift in the average global temperature in these scenarios. But, and this is really where we're going, even if we do our best today, we are going to see a shift in the average temperature and so on. So the future is going to be a lot tougher for ecosystems like coral reefs and other ecosystems. So the fifth point, of course, is that coral reefs are highly sensitive to sea temperature. And this is a picture of a bleaching event in 2002 which affected over 60% of the Great Barrier Reef. And what you see here, all the way to the horizon in the Keppel Islands group, are corals that have bleached or they're dying. And what you saw during that period was really only a tiny upward shift, an exceptionally warm summer that came through, very still conditions for a period of about 4 to 6 weeks, and that's the effect on the coral cover at that part of the world. Now, if we look at the timing of bleaching events, they time perfectly with warm periods of water, and these are just one data set of a multitude out there. And what you see here is the winter-summer variability in the Central Pacific, in this case Tahiti, and it goes up and down, and every now and then you get an ENSO event in the Pacific, and you get warmer than normal water in that region, and every time you get that warmer than normal water, you get bleaching events. Now, in each region, there appears to be a set point, a threshold, and this will come up when Lena Bay talks and others. And this threshold seems to be evidence that coral reefs have in the past adapted to temperature, because that threshold for bleaching is lower further away from the equator, and it's higher as you get closer to the equator. But it also gives us the ability to say, okay, well, if this is the switch point of corals today, and that's the information we have, we can then ask the climate modelers to give us how sea temperature might change in the future. Now, I've superimposed here data for the Great Barrier Reef from a study done using the European climate forecasting model. What it shows are sea temperatures going back to 1860 all the way to the end of this century, winter, summer, and so on. This particular model, the ECAM4 model, simulates El Nino events quite well. You plot in the threshold for the three regions, the Great Barrier Reef, southern, central, and northern. And as you see, as you go forward under the forcing of a doubling of CO2, those temperatures go above that line. And of course, in the past, that has meant a shift towards bleached corals. And of course, when you look at that, and you look at those futures and what happens after bleaching events, in some cases you can lose, as Ian Pointer showed for the Scott Reef, you can lose all your corals or next to all of your corals. That's a fairly bleak scenario. Well, of course, there are some assumptions here, and one of them is that the threshold at which this particular behaviour occurs is fixed. But of course, it's quite possible that it's not. And so if we had a moving threshold like this, we might see a situation where we get adaptation or physiological adjustment and so on, and we get away with that. At this point in time, there is not very much good evidence of that threshold being mobile in the sort of timeframes we're talking about. Gets back to the woolly mammoth chasing the environment. The environment's moving so rapidly that things like genetic adaptation, evolving new symbionts or so on, these processes take time. And so I think what we're seeing here is that the evidence is saying that we don't really have that flexibility in the system. And of course, the increasing severity of bleaching over the years, over the past 9 years, we've had 3 major bleaching events, goes some way to say that it can't have been too flexible. There have been some alternative ideas on bleaching as well, and one of those that swept around the world a couple of years ago was that it was not due to climate change, but it was due to a bacterium that infected the coral and made it more sensitive to bleaching. And this hypothesis was put forward by Eugene Rosenberg and others from Tel Aviv University, and they went on to say, well, then maybe we should be thinking about antibacterial treatment of corals and so on and so forth. I'm pointing to this because it's one of the early wins, if you like, in our research at Program 4 in the centre. And this research was done by a PhD student, Tracy Ainsworth, assisted by Jez Roth. They went to Israel. They went to the precise place where this was meant to be happening, the infection of corals happening and the bleaching and so on. They followed bleaching through this annual cycle of bleaching. They couldn't find a single Vibrio, as was, the hypothesis. And so, after doing this work, and it's really quite a nice and very elaborate piece of work, they're able to show that actually bacteria were not the cause here, and actually it is temperature. And of course, temperature and bleaching relate a lot to the plant literature, agriculture. There's a lot of stuff on the fact that you get stress in plants, and I don't think we have any reason now to think that there's any other reason for this. Another point I think that needs to be made is that the levels of atmospheric CO2 don't have to be too high before you start to eliminate reefs. And this goes to the double whammy of ocean acidification. Now, if you look around Australia, you find so-called carbonate reef systems. These are ones that grow up like the Great Barrier Reef and form these magnificent structures. But you also, as you go towards the poles, you have coral reefs that are really communities of corals that don't actually put down any net calcium carbonate. and these are the so-called non-carbonate reef systems. They're lower diversity, and they occur almost at the point where you drop below 200 micromoles of calcium carbonate per kilogram water. And I'm going to come back to this number because this is the magic number. When you look at this, and then you then add onto this the change in CO2 content in the atmosphere, I'm just going to quickly sort of tell you what ocean acidification is all about. CO2 is rising in the atmosphere, 40% of it goes into the ocean, where it reacts with water, releasing a proton, which then finds a carbonate ion, and this is the crucial bit. So it's dissociated and found it's formed a proton. That proton finds a carbonate molecule and forms bicarbonate. The net effect is that as you add CO2 above the solution, the ocean, you drop that carbonate ion concentration precipitously, as it turns out. And of course, that is what you build coral reefs from. So when you do the experiments, and this is just some of the literature out there, there's a Royal Society report that I was involved in recently that summated the evidence for this particular phenomenon. When you look at this and you say, when do corals stop calcifying in a net way, you find this is the carbonate ion concentration. This is calcification over here. As the carbonate ion concentration increases, so does calcification. But it gets very close to zero at about 200 parts per million. That turns out to be 500 parts per million CO2 above the solution. So we've got a point here where you're no longer building, you're no longer calcifying, and of course erosion starts to take over. And reefs lay down calcium carbonate, but most of it actually, more than half of it, probably 90% of it, gets removed by storms and by bioeroding organisms. So it doesn't take much of a shift downwards in calcification rate to then have a zero net accretion. All right, here's another point. This often comes up about starting tourism, Great Barrier Reef tourism in Sydney or in New York, and that is that corals won't disappear, they'll simply migrate to the poles. Well, unfortunately, I'm never a bringer of good news, and I'm getting sick of it, really. Unfortunately, that property of calcium carbonate ions driving the distribution of coral reefs, carbonate ions drop off as you go towards the poles. If you then add the overall drop in the carbonate ion concentration that occurs because of CO2, and this is shown by some work done by Ken Caldeira and one of his postdocs, this is what the world was like. The blue area is where you have optimal conditions for calcification. Anything that falls below 3 is actually below that 200 micromoles per kilogram water threshold. And you can see that as we get to today, we're still above, we've still got the conditions for calcification, but at 450 and 550, we're now starting to get very close or below 3 for most of the distribution of corals. Now, this particular work, which is done with some big simulation models, Ken actually was the person who first coined ocean acidification. This is the reason why we won't see the migration of things like the Great Barrier Reef to the poles. It's also a problem when you get to those higher latitudes because of light. So reefs won't disappear, but they'll change. And of course, that's the nub of the problem. Here we have today, we have regular impacts from bleaching. We've got a reduced calcification rate, but it's still in net accretion. If we go to 450, we start to get to a point where we're no longer building reefs, we're actually having them dismantled. We start to see corals perhaps not being as effective as competitors on the substrate. We might see the world in 250 as a reef that's more like that, which actually resembles a lot of Jamaica and the Caribbean. And so, in a way, we've already got some examples which we should be studying in terms of management, because that may be the future. If we go to the very high levels of CO2, we can probably expect the future to look a little like this, which is where we have a completely crumbling reef framework. We've lost a lot of the biodiversity because that comes with the corals, and Morgan's going to talk about that in a minute. And we have a very different world. And so the management challenges of 30 years from now, if we don't get our act together, may be associated with something that looks like this. Local stresses, I think this is a very important area, and this is where the ARC Centre for Excellence is focusing a lot of effort. An early win was a study that was headed by Terry that looked at the effect of fishing, fish on reef recovery. Very simply, by caging some areas and not caging others, you allowed fish into some places, not into others. We had the 2002 bleaching event, and then you looked at reef recovery, and lo and behold, those reefs that didn't have fish didn't recover, they got covered with sargassum. If you like sargassum, that was a good outcome. If you have fish, though, these things are grazing all the time, removing and essentially balancing the competition while corals take a hold again and grow back. There was quite a comfortable recovery of corals after this particular event. This is an example where local management of local factors is going to be very important and grow in increasing importance as we see the climate change. I'm not going to go into this one. Climate change is not just about corals. Most species on the reef, of those million or so species on coral reefs generally, are not corals, but corals are fundamental organisms whereby if you take away corals, you have the domino effect. You take away the homes for all of those organisms and so on. And then if we just think about what that means, we can see that there's a knock-on effect of these changes where we lose reef function and services, and eventually, when we lose biodiversity, we lose the potential to discover new drugs. We might then see in our neighbourhood, Indonesians may not be able to get as much food as they do off reefs today, etc. As you go down, will people travel 13 hours from the United States to see something that they've got on their back doorstep in the Caribbean? That's worth an estimated $5 billion or more in terms of export earnings into our country from people wanting to come and see a pristine reef, not Florida. Reduce fish populations and so on. So we'll see this theme developed, I think, through the next couple of days, that really this is an issue that's very broad sweeping in terms of this ecosystem. And of course, I don't need to say, to this audience at least anyway, that we really need urgent action. And the action that we need to take is to try and get down to something that stabilises at 500, if that's possible, or below. And there are a number of models that come out with the fourth assessment report. This one is the constant commitment, atmosphere commitment one, which at the moment we don't know how we'd achieve. But this one here, the B1, is a possibility. We could see that actually it's sort of sitting right at that edge of carbonate versus non-carbonate reef systems. At least we'd have something left. We wouldn't be charging up to these much higher levels. Of course, how do you achieve that? And this is a very complex diagram, but I'm going to focus in on really just one issue, and of course it comes down to emissions. And these are the different SRES scenarios from the IPCC. Here's B1. We've got all sorts of things here from the concentration of CHC emissions and so on, and the radiative forces and so on. But what I really just want to focus on is that top panel there, which is the fossil fuel emissions, and to point out that this is the pathway for those emissions. That's an extremely aggressive change in the way we use energy. And of course, this is where we're going at the moment. So we're right at the fork in the road for these unique ecosystems, and indeed for all of the other things that are being changed in Australia, from the drying of our food bowl, from bushfires and so on. So it really is at this point, one hopes, that we can start to engage actively in the sorts of policies that will bring about this change. Because if we don't, we really will lose the Great Barrier Reef. Thanks very much.